I'm being audited, and the writer says, me? Why are they doing this to me? I don't keep good records. A lot of my deductions are estimates. What should I say to the IRS, and what can they do to me?
Well, this is a good question, and it's becoming more relevant as time goes on. The IRS has staffed up quite a few additional auditors, so as a population, we're going to see a lot more audits coming down the road. The way the IRS chooses to audit somebody is off a risk ratio. What the IRS does is they take a sample pool of returns after returns are filed, and they quantify a risk on every line item in that return. And then they create a risk ratio. For example, if a reasonable risk ratio is 2.5 to 7.5, the returns that come within that ratio don't get audited. Returns below 2.5 or over 7.5, and those are random numbers, would get audited. And the kind of thing that would cause the IRS to choose a return to audit would be outrageous expenses in relation to the income on a return. For example, if someone's showing, $50,000 of income, except they're showing, $30,000 of charitable contributions, that doesn't make sense, and it's very likely going to draw an audit. So itemized expenses or Schedule C expenses that don't look reasonable are going to draw an IRS audit. It's going to get picked up by the IRS computer, and the IRS computer is going to analyze that expense, see it's unreasonable, doesn't meet the criterion of a typical return, and it's going to get pulled for an audit. What's happening here with this taxpayer is that they don't feel like they have sufficient records to really substantially defend an audit. When you do get audited by the IRS, it's very important to cooperate to a great extent. The IRS has the ability to summons bank records, so they can really pretty much see the money that goes in and out of your bank account. They can also summons the actual microfiche of the checks. They can find out who you wrote your checks to. They can see what your gross deposits are. So they have a lot of power to figure out what the true amount of tax liability should be. But what's really critical in an audit, and what people really have to understand, is that the audit is not the final determination of what tax liability is actually owed. If this taxpayer gets audited and they don't like the results, they feel like the results are unreasonable or that the auditor was being unreasonable, they can always appeal that audit to the Regional Board of Appeals. And the appeals officers have a more beneficial standard for taxpayers generally. The standard for an auditor is basically like a light switch, an on or off switch. Either you get the deduction or you don't get the deduction. You prove the expense or you didn't prove the expense. However, an appeals officer has a different standard in reviewing whether a deduction is allowable or an expense isn't allowable. And the standard that the appeals officers use is called hazards of litigation. What's the likelihood if, let's say, I took this taxpayer's audit to tax court and wanted to fight the audit in tax court, the appeals officer can consider testimony and other extraneous evidence that the auditors generally don't consider.
So even though you're getting audited, even though you don't have the kind of records you ought to have, you've got a couple of avenues that you can seek so that you don't just pay a huge amount of taxes. You're not necessarily in trouble. And something I wanted to bring up, Sam, in working with you on this tax attorney Q&A and trying to inform people, it's kind of made me pay attention to some of the television advertising I've seen for tax mitigation or tax remediation companies. And boy, be very, very careful who you talk to or who you engage to take care of a tax problem for you. Because boy, some of these companies, the way the ads look, all you have to do is pay them a couple of $1,000 and the IRS vanishes into thin air. That's not quite the way it works.
Yeah, unfortunately, fear is a powerful motivator, and there's a lot of people who feel distressed when they're contacted by the IRS, either for audit or for collection purposes because they owe taxes. And unfortunately, there's a lot of these companies that have been very unscrupulous in the way they've been marketing, and they're allaying people's fears to try and get as large a fee up front as possible, and then they really don't deliver on their promises. That's endemic to our industry. It's endemic to a lot of other industries as well. These marketing firms can do more damage than good in a lot of cases.
So if someone wants a huge upfront fee, just let that be kind of a red flag and ask a whole lot of questions. As what Sam continues to point out again and again is the IRS has got a whole bunch of rules they have to follow. And your best avenue in dealing with the IRS is know what those rules are and just work them in your favor.
Yeah, and not to be biased towards the legal profession because I'm a tax lawyer, but lawyers are generally higher trained. They know the rules better. They know the ins and outs of how to fix a tax case because it's all based on the statutory code of the Internal Revenue Code, and it's also laid out in the Internal Revenue Manual. And people who really understand that and have access to tax court are in a strong position to deal with audits or collections or payroll taxes and those types of situations. So taxpayers have to be pretty careful about who they choose to help them out. It's just like they got to be careful when choosing a doctor or any other type of professional.
Well, you know, and that brings up this lawyer-client privilege thing, is as an attorney, if I hire somebody like Sam, then I can tell Sam any and everything, and the IRS can't make me disclose that or make Sam disclose that. You get some protection.
Yeah, that's generally true. Attorney-client privilege affords people more protection as well. It's not necessary in a lot of cases, but in cases where it is necessary, it's critical.
So in dealing with your IRS tax issue, you owe money, you haven't filed, you got payroll taxes hanging. Every time, 100% of the time, when in talking with the IRS, your best move is to aggressively say, okay, here's the deal, here's the returns I didn't file, and work through this issue with the IRS. Somehow get it done so you don't have to have sleepless nights. There's always a way to handle a tax situation with the IRS. Doesn't matter if you owe them hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. There's always a way to get it done.